Warning: the following program contains subject matter that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time. Benjamin Atkins was born on August 26, 1968, in Detroit, Michigan. Brought into a life marked by poverty, drug dependence, abuse, and a mother whose survival revolved around prostitution. Long before he grew into the man investigators would later call one of the fastest serial offenders in U.S. history, he was a child struggling to survive forces far beyond his control. His mother, Judy Evans, was addicted to heroin and sold her body only to shoot the money she made into her veins. Sometimes she'd bring clients into whatever room she and her sons were staying in. Benjamin later told investigators that he learned early that his mother made her money with men, and that many of those encounters took place in the front seat of a car while he sat only a few feet away. Dr. Emmanuel Tenay, the forensic psychiatrist who reviewed Atkins' background, summarized it bluntly. Prostitution is using intimacy as a vehicle for hostility. And hostility begets hostility. A child exposed to that learns something very dark about the world. By age 4, Benjamin and his 5-year-old brother were abandoned. Judy Evans quit her job at a downtown hotel and vanished shortly before Christmas, leaving both boys with a friend for months. When police finally located her, she was described as sullen, heroin-addicted, a woman who indicated she was a prostitute and ended up in jail on a bad check charge. While she drifted between jail cells, run-down apartments, and emergency shelters, Atkins and his brother were pushed through a revolving door of foster placements. Caseworkers documented a life spent bouncing from one foster home or institution to the next, attending school sporadically and carrying a quiet, simmering resentment he could not articulate. It wasn't long before the emotional harm began manifesting in more openly traumatic ways. At age 10, Benjamin reported that an older figure in his mother's orbit forced him to provide sexual favors on him. Not described in graphic detail, but clearly an incident of exploitation and control. The records emphasize it was non-consensual, harmful, and formative. Benjamin said years later, "That was when I learned to stay away from people." Another episode occurred when he was around 15, when he woke up to find an older man orally copulating him without his permission. A moment he told detectives made him feel frozen, confused, and angry at the world. These events were never properly investigated, treated, or even acknowledged by adults at the time. The psychological evaluations suggest a boy who learned early that the world was predatory, that violation and abandonment were normal parts of life, and that adults who should have protected him often caused the greatest harm. A caseworker noted, Benjamin was a child who seemed accustomed to being unwanted. As Atkins grew older, conditions worsened. His mother, still on dope and drinking heavily, living with an alcoholic boyfriend, and bouncing her teenage sons between overcrowded apartments. In one placement, a state worker noted that the environment was so chaotic that the boys had virtually no adult supervision. Relatives later described scenes of the brothers wandering the neighborhood at night, begging neighbors for food, or disappearing for days without anyone noticing. By age 13, they were both placed on probation after breaking into a business on West Grand Boulevard. On Christmas Day, 1982, both brothers were arrested once again, this time after attempting another burglary. Benjamin was ordered into a juvenile guidance program, but the facilities were overcrowded. He was placed back into the same environment that had failed him before. One counselor wrote, "Benjamin lacks trust. He has trouble connecting actions to consequences. He has been emotionally neglected in ways that are difficult to quantify." During this period of his life, Ben drifted deeper into the street economy, selling his body to men along Woodward Avenue. To him, it wasn't prostitution, it was simply hustling, just another way to survive. Woven into this chapter was a secret relationship with Carl, a man who happened to be one of his mother Judy's acquaintances. Judy had no idea what was happening between them, Ben later claimed. Carl eventually introduced him to a friend named Dobie, and both men began paying Ben in exchange for sexual encounters. Despite these dealings with older men, Ben occasionally spent time with girls his own age, not sexually, but socially. And even then he felt awkward, withdrawn, unsure of himself around them. Not long after, he became entangled with a man named George, a local dealer who would later let Ben and his brother stay with him. George was yet another person connected to Judy, further blurring the lines of Ben's already unstable environment. Ben told Clark that this relationship with George stretched on for roughly 5 years. School fell apart shortly afterward. He quit Southeastern High sometime between the 9th and 10th grades, depending on which version of his story he told. Around the same time, he started experimenting with drugs, first marijuana, then psychedelics, according to Abramsky. By 17, his drug use escalated sharply. Cocaine entered the picture on his 17th birthday, introduced by a friend described as a female impersonator, who also arranged for a woman to provide sexual celebration favors. Soon after, Ben transitioned from powder cocaine to crack, marking the beginning of a long, destructive dependency. Every evaluation pointed to the same conclusion. Benjamin Atkins grew up in an environment where violence, abandonment, sexual coercion, addiction, and emotional neglect were daily facts of life, and yet no long-term intervention ever occurred. Dr. Tanai put it plainly during trial. Nobody is born to kill. It is the environment that produces a child who finally needs to strike out, and beneath it all was a simmering, directionless resentment that would eventually find its targets. As Atkins neared adulthood, the emotional injuries of his early years remained unaddressed. In later interviews, detectives noted that he often repeated the same phrase with quiet resignation. "Nobody cared what happened to me." That belief, etched into him long before his arrest, became the foundation for the darkness that would eventually define his adult life. Benjamin Atkins's killing spree began without warning, without a clear escalation that police could later identify, and without the typical cooling-off period seen in other serial offenders. Former FBI profiler Robert Ressler called the pace remarkable, noting that Atkins killed 11 women in roughly 5 months, sometimes a victim every 2 or 3 weeks. Investigators said the killings formed a 1.4-mile death strip running from Detroit into Highland Park, a corridor of abandoned houses, derelict motel rooms, and vacant basements where hookers were easy targets, and easier to forget. Atkins later confessed that he returned to his dump sites repeatedly after each killing, to see if anyone had found them yet. He said he lured every victim the same way. "I offered them crack. They walked with me." And the moment he got them into an isolated room, stairwell, basement, or shower stall, he used the same method each time. "Both my thumbs on the Adam's apple, fingers locked behind the neck they can't breathe." He revived several of his victims mid-attack, only to strangle them again. Debbie Ann Friday, December 14, 1981. Debbie Ann Friday is believed to be Atkins' earliest confirmed murder. Her boyfriend found her body in the basement of a decaying apartment building near Elmhurst and Woodward. Police later testified that her body showed classic signs of Atkins' method: ligature marks on the neck and clothing used as a gag. Her mother broke down on the stand years later, sobbing when asked to identify her daughter's body. Oh Jesus, she cried, barely able to speak. Debbie's death became the first marker in a series of killings that police initially misinterpreted as drug deaths or street-level violence, until bodies began to stack up. Atkins told detectives, "In the final months of 1991, I was sitting out on the porch at 42 Elmhurst when I noticed a young woman lingering near a rundown spot a few doors down, one everyone in the neighborhood knew was a crack house. She kept glancing around, unfocused and restless, like she didn't know where to land. I walked over to check on her and asked what she was trying to find. She told me she was trying to get something to smoke. I let her know I was dealing at the time and could get her what she was looking for. I initially used her own socks to gag her and secured her jacket around the lower part of her face. After that, I pulled her over to the space between 2 metal posts. Once she was there, I tore her blue jeans apart at the seams and fastened one pant leg to one post and the other leg to the opposite post. I used either part of her bra or a strip torn from her shirt to bind her hands behind her. Not long after I finished tying her restraints, she began to regain consciousness. I choked her to make sure she was dead. I checked her pulse on her neck and her heartbeat, and it wasn't beating. I pushed her back to make sure the air was out of her body. Then I left and went home and took a bath. Bertha Mason, December 30th, 1991. Bertha Mason's body was found 2 weeks after Debbie Friday's. She was lying in an abandoned building not far from the first homicide. Police initially believed she had overdosed, but bruising around the neck and torso raised suspicions later that she too had been strangled. This case would later be reclassified after Atkins confessed. I was heading in the direction of Holbrook when I noticed a heavier-set, light-skinned woman standing by the Shell station at Holbrook and Woodward. She called out to me, asking what I was trying to do, and I told her I was looking for someone to smoke with. She said we could go back to her place, but I asked if she knew anywhere else. She ended up leading me a couple blocks south to an abandoned building. We went inside and made our way toward the back, into what looked like the old kitchen area. When we got there, I took hold of her legs, and she lost her balance and fell. I sat on her and choked her till she lost consciousness. I raped her, then turned her face up and started choking her. She wasn't responding at all. I checked for a pulse, listened for her heartbeat, and pressed on her stomach to see if there was any breath left in her. It was clear she was gone. After that, I pulled her along the hallway and moved her to the basement stairwell, letting her body go down the steps where it landed at an odd angle. Patricia Cannon George was found strangled on January 3, 1992, on Kenilworth, just off Woodward Avenue in Detroit. Atkins confessed that he raped her prior to strangling her. Vicky Truelove was found strangled on January 25, 1992, in what used to be the Longfellow nursing home in Detroit. Atkins stated, "I was walking along Woodward when a woman approached me and asked what I was into. I told her I was trying to find someone to smoke crack with. She offered to smoke with me, but the truth was, I didn't have any drugs on me. Using that line was just how I convinced her to come along. She said we could use rock cocaine at an abandoned nursing home nearby, just off Woodward, close to a supermarket that had been bombed not long before. We made our way over there and got inside through a broken window on the north side of the building. After we entered, I grabbed her around the mouth and threw her down. Then I began strangling her. She was lying on her back face up. I placed my thumbs on her Adam's apple and locked my fingers behind her neck. I choked her till she was unconscious. Then I removed her clothes. The Monterey Motel stood like an open wound along the Woodward Strip, its reputation so steeped in desperation that police knew its hallways by smell before sight. On February 17, 1992, 3 women were found strangled and sexually assaulted at the motel. The first woman discovered was Valerie Chalk, found bound and strangled in room 68, hands tied behind her back. Her niece would later tell reporters that Valerie had been staying at the motel, turning tricks for drug money, and was last seen alive on July 7th, wandering near the same stretch of Woodward Atkins hunted. But in truth, her last hours were far more horrifying than her family ever knew. Atkins gave the following account. Atkins described it this way. He pulled her into an alley and slipped through a narrow gap in a gate, dragging her with him. Once they were inside the enclosure, he put her on the ground near the break in the fence and began to strangle her, using both hands with his thumbs pressed along her throat. When she lost consciousness, he pulled her farther along the property, about 4 units down on the motel's north side. I dragged her inside the apartment and I started choking her again. She had woke up and she passed out again when I choked her. Detectives asked if she said anything. Atkins said, "Nothing other than why me." Detectives asked Atkins what he said in response. Without emotion, Atkins said, "Just because you're that bitch." If the Monterey Motel was an open wound, then room 35 was its infected heart. When police opened the shower stall that February morning, the cold inside the tiny cubicle was so intense that officers initially thought the woman inside might be a mannequin. She wasn't. She was Juanita Hardy, only 23 years old, nude, bound, and frozen in an unnatural posture that reflected both the violence of her death and the indignity of her final placement. Her body had been wedged into the stall, knees drawn awkwardly, as though someone had forced her limbs into that position to make her fit. A detective later said the room felt dead even before we knew she was in it. The kind of stagnant cold that abandoned motels accumulate when the heat has long been shut off and the pipes threaten to burst. Juanita's death occurred only hours after Valerie Chalk's. Both women murdered in the same motel. Both discovered on the same morning. Both killed using the same technique that Atkins admitted was always the same. He approached Juanita just as he had Valerie, with crack cocaine in his pocket, and an offer that promised temporary escape from the hunger and withdrawal gnawing at so many women on the Strip. She followed him willingly. Trust was not part of the arrangement. Survival was. A third body was found the same day. She was classified as Jane Doe, but later identified by forensic genealogy in 2024, but her name was withheld by her family's request. Atkins later recalled, "It was late, close to 11 p.m., and the streets were cold, with patches of old snow still on the ground. This was the same woman I had taken to the motel earlier. I spotted her near Woodward and Kirchner, and she called out to me, asking what I was trying to do. I told her I was looking for someone to smoke with. We eventually moved down an alley, where I restrained her by covering her mouth and lifted her through an open bathroom window. After getting her inside, I climbed in as well. Once I was in the room, I began to choke her with my hands. After raping her, I pulled her over to the bathroom and put her inside the shower stall. There were pieces of wall paneling lying on the floor, so I propped one of them up between the shower and the toilet to block the view and keep her out of sight. Once I felt she was hidden well enough, I left the area. I never returned to that motel afterward, and about a month, maybe 6 weeks later, the news reported that bodies had been discovered there. On April 9, 1992, Brenda Mitchell was discovered inside an abandoned 2-story residence along Woodward in Highland Park. Although she was found with a scarf wound around her neck, blood at her mouth, and a mattress covering part of her unclothed body. At first glance, investigators treated the scene as another likely overdose. Brenda struggled with addiction, as many of the victims did, and traces of narcotics were found in her system during autopsy. But something didn't match the typical picture of a drug fatality. Her body bore subtle but undeniable bruising around the neck and beneath the jawline, signs that someone had applied pressure deliberately, violently. The medical examiner noted injuries consistent with manual strangulation, the same pattern later confirmed in victim after victim. Atkins's confession filled in the gaps that the decomposition could not. It was nighttime, and I was heading up Woodward toward 6 Mile trying to find some dope. When I got to the area of Woodward and Pasadena, a woman approached me and asked what I was doing that night. We cut through an alley, and I pulled her behind a vacant house. I brought her up the back steps and inside through the kitchen. From there, I led her into the living room, where an old box spring was lying on the floor. I put her down on it and began to choke her. She lost consciousness quickly and died there. "Did she say anything to you?" Atkins replied, "No, she never had the chance." The vacant apartment building at 2nd and Highland had long been abandoned by the time police pried open its warped door in mid-April 1992. Most residents in the neighborhood didn't even glance at it anymore. It was just another dead structure in a city full of them. But the stench inside that day told officers immediately that this building contained something worse than decay. On the first floor, down a narrow hallway that hadn't seen electricity in years, officers opened a closet door and recoiled. Inside, slumped and almost folded into the space like discarded clothing, was the decomposed body of 43-year-old Vicki Beasley Brown. She had been dead long enough that her skin had begun to darken and split. Insects had already made their slow claim. The odor was so heavy that even seasoned investigators stepped back, covering their mouths. But despite the decomposition, the signs were clear. She had been strangled. Her clothing was torn in a manner consistent with sexual assault. Her body had been manipulated, likely dragged and stuffed into the closet. The position showed no dignity, only disposal. Atkins confessed, "This happened sometime around February or March of 1992, when it was still snowing. I was walking along Cortlandt between Woodward and 2nd, and as I reached the corner near 2nd and Woodward, I crossed paths with a woman. She asked what I was getting into, and I asked her what she had in mind. She said we could hang out for a bit, and I asked if she wanted to smoke crack. She agreed. She suggested going into the building next door, but when we reached the back entrance, the doorway was blocked with old furniture. She hesitated and didn't want to climb over everything. At that point, I grabbed her from behind and strangled her, pressing my thumbs against her throat while locking my fingers behind her neck. She lost consciousness, and I carried her over the furniture inside. After I confirmed she wasn't alive, I covered the lower part of her body with clothing, probably her pants, and placed a jacket from the apartment over her upper body. Then I smoked my drugs and left. Detectives asked, "Why did you strangle this woman?" Atkins replied, "Mostly because I didn't want to deal with the possibility of her or anyone else going to the police, so I strangled them, killed them, all 11. On June 15, 1992, the body of an unidentified black female is found in a building at Woodward at Detroit and Highland Park. The body was identified on July 3, 1992, as Joanne O'Rourke. Atkins stated he raped her prior to strangling her in the same manner as he did with his other victims. On August 21, 1992, the 11th body was found in a garage in Highland Park, sexually assaulted, strangled, and discarded like trash. She was later identified as Osinia Wagner, 22 years old. The investigation did not begin with urgency. It began with resignation, the kind of quiet, exhausted acceptance that settled over Detroit and Highland Park in the early 1990s, when too many abandoned buildings housed too many tragedies for detectives to react with alarm every time a body surfaced. The first cases arrived months apart, scattered across a 2-mile wasteland of rotting homes and hollowed structures. Each scene carried the same stale scent of damp wood, garbage, and neglect. But in those early months, no one believed that the murders were connected. They were filed away as isolated deaths in a region drowning in them. Officers from both cities walked into these locations with flashlights that barely pierced the darkness, making notes in silence as they moved through rooms where insulation sagged from ceilings and window frames groaned in the wind. The victims were women whose disappearances rarely triggered panic, women living in transience, pulled deeper into addiction, swallowed by the margins of Woodward Avenue. Their lives left behind few witnesses and even fewer records. When detectives logged the cases, each file settled into a drawer alone, drifting toward obscurity as the next homicide arrived. But by the time spring approached, something undeniable had taken shape along Woodward. Bodies were appearing too close together, in too many forgotten buildings, with too many similarities to dismiss as coincidence. The women were found in stripped-out basements, gutted apartments, and deserted motel rooms, all within a narrow corridor connecting Detroit and Highland Park. They were discovered nude or partially unclothed, left on floors where dust settled over them like a second skin. Their neck wounds carried the same strange violence, hinting at hands far stronger than their small frames could fight against. One detective later admitted that the shift came not from evidence but from instinct. "We started to feel like someone was moving through these blocks with purpose." Still, the cases were divided between two departments, and information passed slowly. Detroit officers managed some scenes. Highland Park handled others. A victim found in an abandoned structure might fall under one set of investigators, while a woman discovered only a few streets away belonged to the other. Without a central review, the murders looked like the city's usual chaos, until the Monterey Motel changed everything. When 3 women were found inside or near the Monterey within a compressed window of time, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation changed. Officers stood in the hallways of that collapsing motel with an unease they struggled to name. Wallpaper curled from the walls like dead skin, the air carried the metallic scent of winter, and the silence felt dense enough to smother sound. The scenes inside the rooms were grotesquely similar. Discarded bodies left in cramped spaces, torsos marked by compressed throats, the brutality unmistakable even before autopsies confirmed it. Detectives compared the motel killings with those in abandoned houses further south, and felt the first real shiver of clarity. These murders belonged to one person. Only then did Highland Park police and Detroit investigators join forces, spreading crime scene photographs, autopsy summaries, and witness statements across a conference table. The evidence formed an unsettling constellation. a series of deaths circling one another so tightly that the pattern became impossible to ignore. One investigator described the scene like staring at an infection spreading across a map. Each location marking another time, the killer slipped in and out of the city's dead spaces unseen. The real breakthrough came from the only known survivor, a woman who escaped an attack and described her assailant with chilling precision. She spoke of a thin man with a quiet demeanor, someone who did not shout or curse but turned violent with a sudden, startling coldness. Her description was not dramatic, but it was exact. Officers circulated the details among patrol units working the corridor, and slowly, a name began threading its way through stray tips and street conversations. Benjamin Atkins. He was seen drifting in and out of abandoned structures. He was seen near the Monterey Motel at odd hours. He was seen along the same dim corners where women vanished. Officers began canvassing Woodward with new eyes. They entered vacant buildings not once but several times a day. They questioned anyone who lived near the corridor's rusting core. They tracked rumors of a soft-spoken man who approached women with offers that seemed harmless until they weren't. They knew they were looking for someone who understood these abandoned spaces better than anyone else, someone who lived among them, moved through them, and used them as an extension of himself. On a humid afternoon in late August 1992, an officer spotted a familiar figure, moving slowly along the sidewalk near the stretch of Woodward, where multiple victims had last been seen. The man walked with a cautious, almost weightless gait, his shoulders drawn in as if trying to disappear into his own body. Officers had been told to look for someone who matched the survivor's description. This man did, too closely to ignore. They moved with the heavy, measured quiet of people who knew they were approaching something dangerous, but also fragile, a human pressure valve inches from either collapsing or erupting. Atkins stood on the sidewalk, hands at his sides, looking strangely adrift for a man suspected of killing more women in a 5-month window than any serial offender the region had ever seen. Officers called out to him and asked if he was Benjamin Atkins. Atkins nodded his head. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." There was no bargain, no protest, not even a moment of hesitation. One detective later remarked that Atkins behaved as if he had been waiting to be collected, like a man who had finally reached the end of an unbearable internal momentum. Benjamin was cuffed, put in the back of a DPD patrol car, and taken in for questioning. Under the unforgiving buzz of the interrogation room's lighting, Benjamin Thomas Atkins began to come apart. To the officers watching him, the shift felt agonizingly slow. At first, as he faced a rotating line of detectives, the 23-year-old clung to a rigid, expressionless front. He ignored the forced friendliness, the pressure, the psychological nudges meant to draw him in, tactics aimed at the man they believed was the Highland Park strangler, the man who killed women with his bare hands. But then, something in him loosened. The facade cracked. The drifter from Detroit began pushing back, insisting he survived by selling sex to men and that he had nothing to do with the murders. When detectives confronted him about the scratches and bite marks scoring his torso, he insisted they came from a male lover. The investigators sensed the seam. They pried it wider. They challenged his story, asked him what it felt like being with men, questioned how he could bear holding another man close. The bait worked. Atkins edged out of another emotional shell, revealing flashes of the past he rarely spoke about. He admitted he'd been violated as a child. He said his mother worked the streets, something he learned while being made to sit in the back seat of her car during her encounters. Then came the demonstration, chilling in its casualness. "Look at these hands," he said. It was always like this, thumbs pressing down on the throat, fingers locked behind the neck. The detectives responded with rehearsed sympathy. They told him they understood. They told him he needed relief, that holding everything inside was destroying him. And with shocking abruptness, his defenses collapsed. The moment was so sudden that several investigators later said it felt strangely anticlimactic. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll tell you, I did every one of them." From there, Atkins, who had voluntarily given up his right to an attorney, delivered an 11-hour account of coercive sex and strangulation. It was a violent sequence that began with an assault in the fall of 1991 and ended 8 months later. After the deaths of 11 women, Atkins was charged with multiple counts of murder. In 1994, the trial of Benjamin Atkins began under a sky the color of iron, a fitting backdrop for a case that had already shaken Detroit and Highland Park to their core. Long before he entered the courtroom, the public already knew his name, though they whispered it with the tense caution reserved for storms or disasters. The press called him the Highland Park Strangler, but inside the courthouse he was simply People versus Atkins, another defendant standing beneath the weight of 11 women's lives. The courtroom felt crowded, even on the days when every seat was not filled. Reporters lined the benches with notepads ready, their faces drawn tight with anticipation. Family members of the victims sat in rigid rows, clutching tissues or folding their hands so tightly that their knuckles blanched. Many had never met one another before this case, yet grief welded them together. Atkins entered quietly each morning, escorted by deputies who maintained a careful distance, as though unsure what the weight of silence surrounding him might erupt into. He moved without visible emotion, carrying himself with the same subdued, inward-facing demeanor he had shown in interrogation. His eyes rarely drifted toward the gallery, but when they did, they slid across the room like a man searching for an exit that didn't exist. The prosecution wasted no time establishing the tone. They arranged crime scene photographs on poster boards, stark images of basements with dirt floors, abandoned bedrooms, motel showers, and sagging closets. The jurors' gazes shifted from one to another, their expressions tightening as they realized they were looking at a single man's work, not an assortment of unrelated cases. Each photograph told a story of someone who had vanished into the city's neglected corners and reappeared only after violence had stripped them of everything but the truth of how they died. Witnesses stepped forward one after another. Police officers, crime scene technicians, medical examiners, landlords who had never set foot in their own buildings, and finally, the woman who had survived. Her testimony carried the room. She described the man who attacked her, his soft speech, his sudden brutality, the terrifying shift in his demeanor when he closed his hands around her throat. She spoke slowly, pressing each word into the silence like a nail into wood. The jurors leaned forward, some shifting uncomfortably, understanding that this was the voice of the one who had escaped what so many others had not. When the families were asked to identify the victims through photographs or descriptions, the courtroom broke open. One mother sobbed uncontrollably, unable to finish the identification. Another relative stared at the table, refusing to lift her gaze until the moment had passed. The grief in the room became so raw that even the court officers looked shaken. The trial lasted weeks, but the conclusion arrived with the sense of inevitability that accompanies only the clearest of truths. The jury deliberated for hours, not days. When they returned, their faces were solemn, etched with the burden of verdicts they could not unhear once spoken. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 11 times. The judge's voice filled the silence, a life sentence for each woman, stacked one upon another. No possibility of freedom. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a heavy door. Benjamin Atkins would never walk the Woodward corridor again. And with that, the trial ended. Not with relief, but with the somber realization that justice could only account for what happened, not repair it.